The history of raw milk is really interesting.
Which I should just say milk, I guess.
Yeah,
'Cause,
just
like most
just
milk is raw. Like we always drank raw milk through all of history. It's not like people were just like boiling milk before they drink it.
Yeah, and some cultures still are just drinking raw milk.
Yeah, Japan, all the milk you can get is raw.
Yeah.
Yeah, like even at every little 7-Eleven.
Is it really
Yeah.
completely raw over there?
Yeah.
That's
I mean, I think
unreal.
they do have pasteurized ones, but they call it out
Yeah.
because it literally is just raw. Like I remember translating as like 100% raw, and I'm like at like a 7-Eleven, I'm like, oh, sick.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
7-Eleven selling raw milk.
Yeah.
That's my dream future for the US.
Dude, have you been to Japan before?
No, I'm dying to
7-Elevens
go.
in Japan in general are the dream future, dude.
This
They
is
have
like
everything.
the fourth conversation I've had about Japan in the last month,
Yeah.
and it's just making me want to go there more and more.
Dude, I love it so much. I was so sad when I came back this time. This is my third time.
Oh yeah, we were talking about it a bit.
Yeah. I love
dude.
Japan so much. But okay.
I want to go
about-
skiing there. But so the history of raw milk, I think it's important to understand like the dynamics of what was happening in the US during the 1800s. So urbanization was happening and industrialization was happening at a pace that we really hadn't experienced in history. And in the US, we were having tons of immigration and lots of people were moving into the cities away from the fields. So we're seeing this densification in these US cities. And so that put a lot of pressure on the food system. And back then, milk was a big portion of people's calories. It was cheap and it was accessible, and it was just a pretty robust way to get a lot of nutrients into your diet. And for the most part, people were eating and drinking a lot of dairy products. So back then, pasteurization hadn't really become a thing. And in the 1850s, you saw like the whole eastern seaboard had just gotten built up. New York, Boston, DC, Philly, all these cities had just grown so much. And we were running into this problem where there was food shortages, there was lack of actual nutrition to actually get food into the cities. We hadn't really fully scaled out refrigeration yet. So people in cities were, if there was ever any sort of like foodborne illness or any sort of thing that was happening, like it was a stress test on these cities. So milk started to become villainized from the period of like 1850 to the 1900s because we shifted the way that we started to create the milk in general. So what we started doing was packing cows into distilleries because distilleries were a great place to actually end up feeding cows because they had this brewer's waste. So they would just lock up all these cows. They wouldn't move at all. They wouldn't be on pasture at all during the span of their lifetime. They would just get their servings, brewer's waste, and then they would produce a milk-like substance, but it was really, they call it swill milk. And it was this purplish color that usually had to be dyed with some sort of like chalk or plaster of Paris or something else to make it have that white color. So you're getting milk in closer into cities because they were at these distilleries, and it wasn't really milk. And so what they started seeing was disease just started spreading like crazy. And they found out, obviously, it was coming from these sick cows, and people were drinking these sick cows' milk, and therefore they were getting sick. And a lot of it was actually kids who didn't have their immune system built up yet. And the infant mortality rate back then was in some cities was like 50 to 60%.
Holy shit.
Which is wild. So it's clearly a problem, but the problem wasn't necessarily the milk. It was how we were approaching like the systemization of creating milk. And so then Louis Pasteur and Camp start talking about the idea of
that's like pasteurization because his name.
Yeah.
Oh shit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the idea that these germs are causing the problem, and so the solution was we either create a standard where we test the milk and we go through this arduous process of making sure that every gallon of milk that gets created is tested and actually safe to be consumed, or we start this pasteurization method in these places where we're raising cows now and go through the process of actually heating it up, killing that bacteria, and then not really thinking about what else we're kind of losing in the process of doing that. And so through that process, pasteurization became the law of the land, and we started seeing the consumption of raw milk go down over time. And people kind of never really revisited that after a few decades of pasteurization just becoming the standard. And like from a legal perspective, it makes sense. Like, people stopped getting sick because they weren't drinking this disease-ridden milk anymore, but it still wasn't like this healthy version of milk. And I think it's important to know that like we are what our food eats. And if our animals aren't eating a species appropriate diet, if they're not actually healthy, you can, if in particular, if they're actually sick, you can expect to get sick from it.
For sure.
And especially milk, because milk it's actually a highly concentration of white blood cells. So it's going to carry a lot more of the disease as opposed to if you were to eat like the muscle meat of like a sick animal.
Yeah.
So milk just became demonized in a lot of ways during the early 1900s, and we just had this shift. And now raw milk is kind of making a comeback. I think people are starting to revisit our assumptions around it. But even today, we had this conversation at the Athena event. It's really important to understand the process by which the farmer is going through to create the milk. Like you can still find problems with raw milk today, but I think if you look at like what the CDC says about raw milk, it's all negative. And I just like would love to like revisit that assumption with the people who came up with that, because everyone throughout the course of history has been consuming raw milk. It's the first thing that all mammals consume when they're born.
Yeah.
So how are you going to tell me that it's bad for you, you know, or it's innately like something that's going to cause disease. And it's really just the process that we choose to create it and then sell it. And urbanization and industrialization played a huge role in making raw milk not really as popular as it once was.
Have you gone out to like any of the farms around Austin?
Totally.
What is it like?
Yeah. So
like just pick one, I guess. Or do you know the raw milk place that delivers at Squatch?
I do.
Okay.
I haven't gotten to know them personally, but the first place that I started buying raw milk from in Austin was called the Jersey Barnyard.
Okay.
It's about 45 minutes east in Bastrop, or actually town outside Bastrop. But it's we got to talking to the two owners, Ralph and Faith. I think they're fourth generation. They have this beautiful property, and talking to them about raw milk is that like pierced the veil for me, because at that point I had just started consuming raw milk. I had my own concerns. I was like, is this safe? Like there's like no processing that goes behind this to make sure that there's no bacteria in it. But you start hearing their stories of testimonies of people coming to the farm and starting to incorporate raw milk into their diet, and they heal their gut, or they start to incorporate raw milk into their diet and they cure like ulcerative colitis, or, you know, skin problems start going away. And so just like being able to talk to these farmers in a way where they're telling anecdotal stories, and it gave me a perspective that I was like, okay, maybe there's more to this whole conversation. And then you just grow an appreciation for like the effort that goes into actually making really high quality food. Like this is Ralph and Faith's family's tradition to create really high quality food, and they feel beholden to like keeping that standard really high. And they went through a period where their farm burned down, and they thought they were going to lose the farm. They thought they were going to have to sell acreage in order to rebuild the farm. And just stories like that, like the resiliency of these people and how they're just so set on their mission of supporting the local community, putting out really high quality products that create abundant and healthy life, is really empowering, because we've lost a lot of that. I think urban versus rural living has become very delineated to the point where like most people who live in an urban setting have never talked to a farmer. And just some of those conversations were just really refreshing. Like I feel like I was talking to like someone from the past almost, like just these old souls who could just sit there and talk on their stoop for hours and hours. Like we sat with them for like 2 hours and just had a good combo about, you know, what they do, their experience on the farm, the whole history. So yeah, I would encourage anyone to just like go out and like meet someone who creates food.